Alright guys, this is your first online lecture. It's a little bit of a weird format. It's actually my second stab at it because I created one huge file last time and then couldn't find a way to send it to you. Hopefully this will work out for you. Things to remember, I said this in an email earlier, but I am emailing you every single slide and every single piece of content from those slides. So everything I say here is referencing something you have. I'm going to reference specific slides. So slide 1 is the title page. Slide 2 will be the one that the subject line, anxiety, fear, and panic, and so forth. So as I talk and I mention a slide, you can use that slide as a reference point to figure out what I'm talking about. So this is the beginning of Unit 3. We're going to talk about anxiety disorders in general, and today's lecture focuses on panic disorder and specific phobias. We're going to open up with a discussion of what anxiety means in general, and we're going to spend more time on panic than we spend on most of the other anxiety disorders, simply because we're talking about the nature of anxiety in general, and we won't have to do that every single time. So the first part will be a little bit slow on this disorder, but not because it's more important than others, simply because that's where we started. So let's go ahead and get started. So you'll start on slide 2. Again, the subject line at the top of the slide is anxiety, fear, and panic. And normally I'll ask people at this point, can you define anxiety and can you define fear? Because in this field, there's a tendency for the meaning of words to get blurred and for people to use them interchangeably when in fact there are actually important differences between the words. And so in this case, I'll just tell you, anxiety is a future-oriented term. When you are anxious about something, you have the sort of psychological and physiological reactions that are sort of muted versions of our fight and flight response, but you have them in response to something that hasn't happened yet. You're anticipating something bad will happen. So anxiety is future-oriented. Fear, on the other hand, is present-oriented. It's the same set of psychological and physiological responses, but they are in response to something that's actually present. So you're anxious about something that might happen. You are afraid of something, or you are fearful of something that is happening. So anxiety disorders as a class are a bunch of disorders characterized by the fact that people are nervous about something that will happen in the future, as opposed to responding to something that happened to them in the past, or that is happening to them right now. As is the case with a lot of other things we talk about, there's a lot of distorted cognition going on here. We believe something will happen that won't, or if it does, it won't be as bad as we fear it will be. And so we avoid things that we think will bring those bad outcomes. The last word on this is panic, and panic is essentially that same set of physiological and psychological responses on steroids. Panic is your full-blown fight-or-flight impulse telling you to either get out of there or to fight in order to survive. And so we will talk about the exact nature of what a panic attack is in just a little bit. But that's the difference between those three words: anxiety, fear, and panic. The main difference being anxiety is about the future and fear is about the present. A main point a lot of people have in terms of criticisms of anxiety disorders in general, and this is true of a lot of other mental illnesses, the idea of, well, we all have some of this. Maybe you're just slapping a label on something. And it's a legitimate concern. But there are some things to consider when we're talking about anxiety disorders. One is that in order for anyone to meet criteria, it needs to be severe enough to lower your quality of life. So if you're fearful about something, but it doesn't really matter, then you don't need to come to a clinic, you don't need a diagnosis, you don't need treatment. But if it's severe enough that it's lowering your quality of life, then it's hard to say you're just slapping a label on something. Similarly, your fears need to be chronic and frequent enough to interfere with functioning. So they need to be there for a long period of time, and they need to come up often enough that it causes problems. And then the last one is that it needs to be out of proportion to the dangers that someone is truly facing. So if I am afraid of a rabid animal that comes into our classroom and attacks me, that's legit. I should be afraid of that. That animal's trying to kill me. But if I'm afraid of a domesticated cat that's on the other side of the classroom and not even looking at me, well, then that's a little bit out of proportion with the danger that I'm actually facing. And so anxiety disorders, again, are a class of disorders characterized by being afraid of something that hasn't happened to you, and also those fears generally are at a volume that isn't consistent with what they should be. This is again one of those points in the lecture where I normally like to have a long discussion with you guys, and students typically have some really good ideas, and I'll ask the question, all this being said, why is anxiety actually a good thing? Why is it good that we have it? And people usually land on some of the right answers pretty quickly. And the main gist is that evolutionarily speaking, we need it. If we weren't fearful of things that were dangerous, we would die. Anxiety gives us important information. It cues us to get away from something that's going to harm us, or to adjust our behavior so that we don't get the same bad outcome that we had before. If we weren't fearful of predators, they would kill us. If we weren't fearful of heights, we would fall off cliffs. Anxiety sort of reins our behavior in and keeps us from going past our limits. So as a species, we need it. That being said, anxiety is a sort of idea that it includes not only sort of thoughts, things about I am afraid of this, and not only behaviors, I'm going to avoid this, but also a lot of physiological responses. And those were particularly key early on in our sort of state of evolution before we really had advanced linguistics and stuff like that. And so anxiety is a series of messages that our body sends to us in a pretty primitive way, and very normative way that's not unhealthy. And so if you look at slide number 4, you see a big table of symptoms. I'm going to talk about some of the somatic symptoms. You see things like your heart rate increasing and pumping harder. And as it turns out, your body, when you need to fight something or run away from it, needs to get blood to the right series of muscle groups capable of impacting that type of behavior. And so for this to happen, your heart beats quicker and with greater strength. But it's not just that blood flow increases throughout your body, it's that it increases in particular areas and decreases in others, which is essentially your body's way of saying, there are some things I need to do right now, and I don't have enough resources to manage all of my standard stuff. And so I'm going to deprioritize some and prioritize others. And so you'll notice sometimes when you're anxious, your fingertips or your toes get numb. That's not because you just sort of spooked out. It means that blood flow is actually decreased there, with your brain basically saying, well, if I need to hit something or run away from it, fingertips aren't as big a priority as biceps or hamstrings or quadriceps. And so I'm going to limit the amount of blood flow that's going to those areas and prioritize the areas that are more responsible for larger movements involved in running away or fighting. A couple other things you'll notice. Stomach acid is inhibited is one of the things listed there. Your body basically says, you know what, I don't need to worry about digesting my food right now, I need to worry about surviving. However, when you inhibit stomach acid and digestion slows down, you feel nauseous. And so a lot of you guys may have noticed sometimes when you feel really fearful, you kind of feel like you want to throw up. It's normative. These things happen. So I want you to look at this list of behaviors and be generally familiar with them. And we can talk about them more when I return to class and answer specific questions about why some of them are useful and why some of them aren't. But I want you to keep in mind in general that there are a lot of components to anxiety, both the way our body responds and sends us messages, the way we feel emotionally, the kinds of thoughts we have, and the types of behaviors we do. And each of these things can impact our response to our environment, the strength of our anxiety, how long it exists. And they also make for great targets in terms of education and treatment. So you move to the next slide, talking about symptoms of a panic attack. I'm going to run through these quickly, except to keep each clip to 10 minutes or less. But you'll see things like heart palpitations, pounding heartbeat. We talked about that. Numbness and tingling sensations. We talked about that as well. Chills or hot flashes. If your blood flow changes in various parts of your body, that's going to impact temperature regulation. So you'll feel hot or cold depending on what's going on in that particular area of your body. Sweating. Some folks believe that it was evolutionarily beneficial for us to sweat when we're anxious because it made us slippery and more likely to escape. That's not necessarily true, we just don't know. Some other stuff, the sensation of being short of breath or smothering, hyperventilation. People hyperventilate when they're anxious, but they actually are breathing. They're not about to suffocate. It isn't actually all that harmful, but people freak out about it. Talked about nausea already, but also the sense of dizziness or detachment from reality is pretty common for a lot of people. And again, it's a matter of blood flow. Blood flow is changing in your brain, and your brain responds to that with some feelings that sometimes are a little bit aversive or confusing or just flat out weird. So the idea is that your body does this stuff normally to send a message. The problem is when we misinterpret it, because then we get more anxious and our body does it more. And then we misinterpret it again, and our body does it more, and we get more and more and more and more anxious until that anxiety explodes into a panic attack. And a panic attack must reach its peak by 10 minutes after its onset. This is something that happens. It's a quick burst of something extremely uncomfortable. So we're going to talk about this some more. I'm going to pick up on the slide in a second, but I'm going to pause this here so that we don't go over the YouTube limit of 10 minutes.